So Chelsea back in Premier League action on Saturday night against Brentford. It's a ground we don't really enjoy going to, but can Maresca's team finally break a little bit of a curse and get the 3 points to start this next block of the season off in the best way possible? It is going to be a busy period covering Chelsea, that is for sure, because we're on the eve of the Champions League returning. We've got League Cup games, we've got trips to Old Trafford facing Liverpool, a lot of stuff to cover. But today, obviously, focusing on Saturday night's game. Please do like, subscribe. I'm Daniel Childs. If you're new to the podcast, new to the YouTube channel, this is my team selector, my match preview ahead of Chelsea games, where we'll be looking at the opposition, focusing on what Enzo Maresca had to say in his pre-match press conference, and then giving you my predicted lineup for the game and the reasons why. The first place to start is, of course, the press conference. Enzo Maresca speaking in a very cool kind of, I think it was jumper, sweater. It was very casual, not Chelsea branded at all. So that was pretty new for Enzo Maresca. He came in feeling a little bit more autumn as the seasons change in the UK. It was obviously, I think, the biggest talking point for this presser, as it was pre-Fulham, as it probably always will be when injury and fitness looms over the head of Cole Palmer. It will be about him. And luckily, Palmer trained yesterday, but this was for the first time for a while. And I think that leaves a big question mark over how he is going to be managed in this next block of games, because he's a huge player for Chelsea. He's a transformative player for Chelsea. But because of that, you don't want to rush him back. You don't want to use him irresponsibly. And you know, with a blockbuster game against Bayern in midweek, I mean, that is when you'd want Cole Palmer to play some football, but it's about getting him back up to that match fitness. So it creates a bit of a conundrum. On top of that, with the internationals returning, so Esteval, Willian, João Pedro, Andre Santos, obviously a late return, as was for Moises Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez. You know, there's question mark over the South American players, as there always is. You know, I always used to think back to, you know, Thiago Silva whenever he'd return from international duty very late, and it'd always be a late judgment call over whether he plays the game. It's not a 12:30 kickoff on Saturday. It's a later kickoff, which is a little bit more preferable. But again, there will always be that judgment call. But, you know, it's not something new. It's not something these players have never coped with before. So I think that is also something you have to factor in when we're kind of concerned that these players are going to be able to manage these minutes, because they've done it consistently. Another part as well is the striker conundrum, and Enzo Maresca spoke about that. He said the only number 9 is Guiu, and João can also play there. Against Fulham, we use Tyreek George as a number 9, so we also think about him. I wrote a piece, my first piece for Hooligan Soccer. Go and check it out. I'll be doing regular pieces for them moving forward. And it's all about Guiu. It's all about the striker conundrum with Liam Delap's injury. So go and check that out in the description box below and follow their work, because I will be contributing to that site pretty regularly. And I give my thoughts about Guiu because it's kind of hard to know what we're going to get. But that is another issue as well. And we'll talk about that when I give you my predicted lineup for this game. Looking at Brentford, a team that Chelsea historically, since they got promoted to the Premier League in 2021, have not always fared well against. It was actually last season where we won at Stamford Bridge for the first time against them since they got promoted. So, you know, it's not always been a great team. They're an awkward team to face. Tactically, they're physically robust, they're strong at set pieces, but of course there is the major dynamic difference this season, because of course the departure of Thomas Frank, the departure of Brian Mbeumo, and the departure of Yohan Wissa. Those are 3 individuals that make a lot of difference, a lot of quality there on and off the pitch. Keith Andrews, I mean, I still feel he may not see out the season at Brentford, and it may be a little bit harsh, but you know, if you look at their first 3 games of the Premier League season, they were beaten convincingly on the opening day by Nottingham Forest, who haven't had a great start themselves. They did beat Aston Villa at home. That was their only home game so far, and may also contribute to why there is some trepidation about tomorrow for Chelsea. And then of course they lost very late on against Sunderland, just before the international break. So 15th in the league. Igor Thiago is their top scorer so far, but obviously very early days. I mean, in terms of average possession, they're around 18th, and expected goals are around 9th. So they're actually, their XG is a little bit higher, but you have to factor in they did get a penalty in the game against Sunderland. They should have scored, and that may have turned out to be very different. So, I mean, Keith Andrews maybe is looking at it and going, actually, I've beaten Aston Villa. That was a big home win, and we're maybe a little bit unfortunate with the way things turned out at Sunderland, and I could be sat here with more points. If you look at the bulk of their team, there still are, familiar names. There still are players like Mikkel Damsgaard, who I think is a very creative and influential figure, maybe underrated for the level he plays at. Dango Atora scored the winner against Aston Villa. He's a new signing from Bournemouth, and if you saw the nature of that game, I think the Villa game is the one you'd be looking at as kind of probably the easiest one to kind of reference in terms of their approach, in terms of how this game's going to go, because they had not a lot of the ball. Villa had to break them down, had to try and break them down, and failed to break them down, and they had one real great a transition opportunity where they scored the winner, and also they were really impactful and dangerous as they usually are from long throws. So again, these are things that we know about Brentford, and I think it's Keith Andrews trying to stick with what the identity of Brentford has been and why they've maintained in the Premier League for so long. And it's why I have a lot of respect for Brentford, because they're not one of these teams that have come up to the Premier League in recent years and tried to play a game that they're never going to win. They play with the tools they have. They're a very functional team. They remind me historically of like Blackburn and Bolton, but those teams at times did do things that were quite impressive in their era, and that's not a condemnation. That is, I think, a praise. And it's why even with a Brentford without Thomas Frank, without some of those key players that have left this summer, you still have to look at it as maybe one coming off an international break that could be a little bit tricky for Chelsea. It's not going to be a game you'd suspect where Chelsea, a bit like Fulham, is going to be rampant. It's going to be a game where Chelsea are going to have to do something they haven't, because the record at this ground is pretty poor for Chelsea. Yes, we haven't lost there yet since they got promoted. The only win coming in our first visit, and that was the 1-0 goal by Ben Chilwell back in 2021 on the Tuchel, where we got absolutely battered, it felt like, for the last period of that game, and Mendy made a series of ridiculous saves. Since then, it's been 3 draws. In 2022, it was 0-0. In 2024, under Pochettino, it was 2-2. And in last season, it was 0-0. Very similar games, quite turgid games, difficult games, especially the 2 0-0s. So it's how Chelsea are going to be able to get round that, because I do have some concern that Chelsea's starts to games have not been great so far this season. If I look at the 3 Premier League games so far, we didn't start quickly against Palace. We didn't start quickly against West Ham, but we recovered very well. And against Fulham, we also didn't start well. But again, talk about VAR, disallowed goals, but then we capitalised on set pieces. And I think that's maybe the little bit of difference here for me from a Chelsea point of view, where I'm a little bit more optimistic in the fact that there's more adversity, there's more depth to this team. And with the threat at set pieces, attack-wise, that we have now at our disposal, when you have a player like Joao Pedro, that can bail you out of situations. But it's something that I do want to see improved, because, we're going up to Old Trafford. We're facing Bayern Munich. We're going to face Liverpool. You can't keep starting games sluggishly and expect to get away with it in the long term. You give yourself a mountain to climb, and you are then very much narrowing the margins for error game to game. So I'd like to see Chelsea look a lot more convincing from the start of this game, and hopefully can pick up what would be, I think, a good 3 points, because as I say, it's a ground Chelsea historically have not been good at. And it would maybe be a sign of Chelsea's development that they're able to come through these games with the challenges of fitness and form and coming off an international break around it. So looking at my predicted 11, Rob Sanchez will obviously start in goal. The back 4, I think Malo Gusto is going to start. I felt that maybe if Reece James hadn't have started that other England game the other night, he may have found his way into the starting 11, but just the way they've managed Reece James so far, physically, yeah, in a test against Brentford, who are going to put a lot of balls into the box, aerially are going to be looking to trouble you. Yeah, I'd prefer Reece James over Malo Gusto, but I just think the way we've managed Reece, I can't really see him starting both the Brentford and Bayern Munich games and then Old Trafford. I mean, you kind of have to pick your poison here. You kind of have to sacrifice a game, or at least if you don't want Reece, what is the game out of that trio that you don't want Reece James starting, or you feel you can afford to not have him start? And I think this is the one out of the 3. I'd much prefer that Reece is starting against Bayern Munich and featuring against Man United. So I think Malo Gusto, who, to be fair to him, has been in good form this season, stretching back to the Club World Cup, I think will start this game and probably playing that advanced wing-back role that I like to see him play in when he is starting for Chelsea. I think the back three will be Trev, Tosin and Cucurella. I say back three in possession. Trev and Tosin, Tosin very much the set-piece specialist. I think he'll start this game as well. Trev, obviously has once again started the season really commendably, and despite of course the centre-back concerns, I think the defence hasn't been too bad so far this season. So I think that will maintain. I think the intrigue will be whether that will be the same looking defence that we start against a team like Bayern Munich. They're going to have to face tests they haven't in the season so far, and whether they can hold up to those tests without Levi Colwell. So yeah, Cucurella also starting. The midfield two, I do think Caicedo will be ready to start this game. Dario Asugo getting injured, possibly. I mean, there's no good time to get injured, but possibly at the worst time, because you maybe could have made an argument here. Caicedo returning back late from international duty, maybe you start Dario Asugo, but I do think Moises Caicedo. The only other thing I would say is that Andre Santos is a name I'm starting to look at and go, with injuries further up the pitch, with the workload starting to increase, and the way Maresca used Andre in the Club World Cup. I mean, we have seen Andre Santos deployed as a deep defensive midfielder for Enzo Maresca, so that may be something to look at, and especially against this type of opposition. Again, maybe you would start Andre Santos, but I think Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez of course contributing goals in the last two Premier League games, much better level of performance, or at least just contributing in the final third. I think Esteval should start, and my reasoning for this is just, I think against this type of opponent where it's going to be not the greatest game to watch, you need flair, you need inspiration, you need someone who's going to try something a little bit audacious and just inject energy into the team. Because I've watched us go to Brentford and games just drift and us be very stifled in attack. That simply, you can't allow that rhythm to set in, because Brentford will then feel comfortable and gain encouragement. And I think Esteval, especially linking up with Malo Gusto, I think there's real encouragement there with that duo, and just the way Chelsea, when they're at their best and their fluid best, I think Esteval will be a big part of that. Joao Pedro will obviously keep on starting. He's a threat from set pieces. He's a threat in open play. He's Chelsea's best performing player, or at least most influential player right now, and given he wasn't at the club a couple months ago, I think that's really impressive. I also think Pedro Neto will start off the left. Jamie Gittins and Alejandro Garnacho, I mean, the question will be, are they going to feature in this game? Especially, I think more intrigue will be on Garnacho, of whether we see his first Premier League minutes for Chelsea in this game. But obviously he's been training at Cobham, and whether he's ready to go straight in, given he hasn't played competitive football for a while, like he wasn't involved in Man United, so they may wait a little bit to kind of ease Garnacho back in to Premier League minutes. And I do think Mark Guiu's going to start. I'd prefer Mark Guiu start this game than Tyreek George as a number 9, if that is the way Maresca is feeling. This is the first big opportunity. I mean, I don't think any of us would have anticipated that Mark Guiu would be starting the Premier League game following the international break. If you told me this when we were at the Fulham game, I would have laughed at you. I mean, it would have been an insane level of occurrence for that to happen. But listen, Delap gets injured, Jackson doesn't return. Guiu now has the opportunity. I think as a physical presence, you can see why from a profile point of view, he's, I think, a much better fit in this role than Tyreek George. I like Tyreek George, and I think he, at times last season, he did a commendable role when Jackson was suspended and in some of the Conference League games, but this is not a role for him. He just, physically, it's not a role for him. The role should be for someone who's going to be able to cope with the physical demands, especially against a team like Brentford. And you could just see Tyreek George getting swamped, a little bit like he was against Fulham when he was asked to play that role after Delap got injured. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Mark Guiu, and whether he can begin to take it and prove doubters like myself wrong in terms of, I think he's very, very raw. And I think he is someone that just needs minutes. And maybe these minutes will, again, around quality players, will bring him up to a level. But it's kind of unknown, because we saw so little of him in a Chelsea shirt in a serious competition. I mean, listen, we loved winning the Conference League, but in terms of Premier League minutes, I think it was like 71 minutes last season he got in the Premier League, which is staggeringly low. And obviously he had injury problems, and he hasn't been playing for Sunderland in the Premier League when he was on loan there. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity, but I my instinct is I think Guiu starts, and it's maybe the chance for him that he did not expect to get. And I don't think many of us expected him to get it. So Those are my thoughts. That is my preview for the Brentford game on Saturday night. Please let me know your thoughts, your team selections in the comments below. Follow across the socials at SonOfChelsea. Check out all the links in the description box below, and I will see you again very, very soon. All the best.